Welcome to the MCAT Basics podcast, brought to you by the physicians at Med School Coach. Each week, Sam Smith breaks down high-yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Welcome to MCAT Basics. I'm Sam Smith.
I'm Alex Sarks.
This episode covers the lymphatic system.
We're first going to talk about the structure of the lymphatic system and then delve into its major functions. This material will show up on only one of the four sections, that being the bio and biochem section.
So with that said, I hope you find this podcast helpful in your studies, and good luck to those of you who are taking the MCAT soon. So you guys may have noticed there that we had another voice kind of recording that intro. That is Alex Starks. He's going to be taking over the podcast coming up, I guess, in the next few weeks, as I am leaving to join a med school and kind of move on from the podcast. So Alex, first of all, thanks for doing this, and maybe just tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sam. I'm super excited about the opportunity of taking over the podcast, and of course, my hope is to continue to deliver the quality content that you've been delivering over the past couple years. So a bit about myself. I am the Associate Director of MCAT with Med School Coach, the sponsor of the podcast. And I have been in the MCAT space for going on 6 years now. I took the MCAT in 2016 and then again actually in 2020, and have been tutoring students. I think my count's a little bit over 400 about now, and have been developing content from full lengths to scripts for audio courses and questions and all sorts of things. So I have been living and breathing the MCAT, maybe a bit too much, for quite a while now.
So that's all to say that you guys are going to be in very good hands, in the next year or however long Alex stays. So with that said, you guys are here to hear about the lymphatic system, and we're going to do this a little bit differently than I have done in the past. Both of us are going to kind of be here and talk about the lymphatic system. So let's get to that. Blah, 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 blah. So I first wanted to start out just kind of by talking about what exactly the lymphatic system is. So most generally speaking, and most broadly speaking, the lymphatic system is an organ system that consists of a network of vessels and nodes, called lymph nodes, that serve three main functions. Its primary functions are, number one, to return fluid to the blood, number two, to support the immune system, and number three, to absorb fats and fat-soluble nutrients. More on all those functions in a sec. I first want to talk about the structure of the lymphatic system. So the structure of the lymphatic system consists of several different components. We have lymphatic vessels, lymphoid organs, lymphoid tissues, and the circulating lymph. I'm going to start with that last one first. So lymph, or circulating lymph, as I just said, is the fluid that's transported in lymphatic vessels. And this fluid is a little bit kind of milky looking. It's like this white it's not quite like milk. It's a little bit more runny, but it's same general idea as milk. And it contains proteins, excess fluids, and pathogens. Pathogens being things like bacteria, viruses, cancer cells, etc. Its composition is pretty similar to the plasma that's in the blood. So that's lymph. That's the fluid that flows through the lymphatic system. Now, lymphatic vessels are the vessels that transport lymph fluid. These are basically like blood vessels, only instead of carrying blood, they carry lymph. And for some reason, they're always depicted as green in like diagrams of the body, like in anatomy. You got the blood vessels, which are red and blue, and then the lymphatic vessels are green. Now, what these lymphatic vessels do is that they converge to a structure called the cisterna kylie, which sits right between the cisterna kendall and the cisterna chloe. No, just kidding. It sits right above the navel, right above the belly button. The cisterna kylie it's been described as a lymph node-like structure. In fact, Wikipedia describes it as a, quote, dilated sac, which I think that's a pretty good description of what it looks like. If you want to Google a quick picture of it, that's basically what it looks like. Now, so basically all the vessels, all the lymphatic vessels below the cisterna kylie converge at it and then flow up from the cisterna kylie in one vessel upwards. It's basically this very large afferent vessel that runs kind of at the top of the cisterna kylie and that carries the lymph upward. There are also two ducts in the lymphatic system. These are part of the lymphatic vessels that open up and dump lymph into the bloodstream. Basically, if the lymphatic vessels were pipes, ducts would be like spouts where the water could come out of the pipes. And this helps the lymphatic system do main function number one, and that is returning fluid to the blood. More on that in a little bit. The duct on the right side of the body is called the right lymph duct, and that dumps lymph into the right subclavian and right jugular veins. And then on the left side of the body, you have the thoracic duct, and that dumps lymph into the left subclavian vein and left jugular vein. Now, the thoracic duct is quite a bit bigger than the right lymph duct, and that's why it gets kind of this special name. Instead of being called, the left lymph duct, it's called the thoracic duct. All right, moving on. So there are two types of lymphoid organs that exist within the lymphatic system. We have primary lymphoid organs and secondary lymphoid organs. Primary lymphoid organs include bone marrow and the thymus. And this is where lymphocytes are formed, and this is where they mature. That contributes to that main function number 2. On the other hand, secondary lymphatic organs include the lymph nodes, the spleen, the tonsils, these things called the Pier's patches, and a mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT. It's in these organs where the cells of the immune system do their actual job of fighting off germs and foreign substances. Again, as I dive more into the functions of the lymphatic system, I'll talk more about that. But what I want to do first is kind of talk a little bit more in detail about some of these organs that are within the lymphatic system. So I'll start with bone marrow. So bone marrow is kind of the spongy looking stuff that's inside of bones. And something that I didn't know, and Alex, you might find this kind of interesting too, is that it's highly vascularized. I don't know if you knew that. Did you know that?
I did know that, but it does seem odd to me. And the way that I try and remember the fact that it's highly vascularized is because we have to get a bunch of blood cells out of the bone marrow because that's where they're made.
Right, that's where they develop. In the middle of the bones, I don't typically think about it as having, a bunch of vasculature running through it, but I guess it does. Another interesting thing about bone marrow, it tastes pretty damn good. I don't know if you've ever had any, Alex, but it's kind of at fancy restaurants, at least where I've had it, but it always is pretty good.
It is very, very good.
Which is another, you wouldn't think that. You wouldn't think eating the middle of a bone is good, but it is. Now, the main function of the bone marrow, and Alex kind of just alluded to this, is in producing cells. So it's filled up with these stem cells that can then mature and differentiate into really any different type of cell. Now, in terms of the lymphatic system, we're interested in it supporting the immune system. And so what we're interested here in is the development of immune cells. So a lot of different immune cells come from the bone marrow, that being B cells, T cells, natural killer cells, neutrophils, etc. Now, one thing that the bone marrow is kind of known for is being the site of B cell maturation. I remember this by thinking bone marrow, B cell. I associate those B's together. And remember, B cells are part of the humoral immune response. They produce antibodies that bind specifically and tightly to antigens. The thymus is the next organ that I mentioned, and it's an organ that's located right below the sternum, kind of in the middle of the chest. And interestingly, lymphatic vessels only travel away from the thymus. There's no afferent lymphatic vessels that kind of run to it. They only run away from it. And this is a place where T cells grow and mature. T cells, of course, are produced in the bone marrow, as I just mentioned, but they grow up and they mature within the thymus. And you can remember this by thinking T cell, thymus, again, associating the first letters of those terms. Now, once T cells have fully matured in the thymus, they migrate to the lymph nodes through lymphatic vessels. I'll talk about the lymph nodes next, but they play a big role in immune function. One last thing, and this is pretty weird. The thymus is a bit of a weird organ. It actually shrinks and disappears as we age. Did you know this is a thing, Alex?
Yeah, it's called Thymic Involution, and I agree, it's one of the oddest things about the body.
Yeah, it's super weird. Basically, the thymus, ever since you're born, the very first year that you're alive, the thymus just kind of continuously shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and it's replaced by adipose tissue, by fat tissue, until it basically is just gone. And I guess the paper I was reading said the thymus would completely disappear by the time I think you reach like 105. So it just completely shrinks, replaced by fat tissue until eventually, if you get to 105, it's just completely gone. Anyways, the big takeaway here is that the thymus is involved in T cell maturation. And T cells, again, are part of cell-mediated immunity. Thus, the thymus contributes to cell-mediated immunity, and it supports the immune system. All right, now on to lymph nodes. So you have a bunch of lymph nodes all over your body. You've probably kind of felt for them on your neck or, under your jaw, I guess, when you're sick to see if they're swollen. Well, you have about 500 to 600 of these distributed throughout your whole body. With that said, though, they're concentrated in the neck, the armpits, the groin, and around the gut. Now, structurally speaking, lymph nodes are small bean-shaped structures. They kind of look like miniature kidneys in a way. And also, like the kidneys, lymph nodes have an outer cortex layer called the capsule and an inner layer called the medulla. They also have efferent and afferent lymphatic vessels that are running through them, basically vessels that go into and out of the lymph node. And then the last thing I'll say here is that lymph nodes are all connected to each other through a network of lymphatic vessels. Now, also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, functionally speaking, these serve as reservoirs for immune cells. So they have a bunch of immune cells in them, and as different pathogens, different things come through the lymph fluid, they'll make their way into these lymph nodes. And if it's something bad, then you have all these immune cells there to kind of fight off that foreign particle, fight off that pathogen. And again, I'll get more into that in a little bit. For now, just think about the kind of bean-shaped structure of these lymph nodes and the fact that they're kind of distributed all over the body. So next is the spleen. The spleen is an organ that is in the upper left part of the abdomen, a little bit to the left of the stomach. And structurally speaking, it kind of looks like a big lymph node. And it serves really two main functions. One is related to blood, the other related to immunity. In terms of blood, it removes old red blood cells and acts as a reservoir for blood. On the other hand, in terms of immunity, it contains a bunch of different immune cells, white blood cells, that fight infections and deal with pathogens.
Can I make a note about what you need to know for the spleen for the MCAT?
Yeah, go ahead.
Pretty much nothing, which is great, right?
That is great.
So the removing of the old red blood cells and the fact that it has something to do with immunity is really important. However, when you're all doctors, the spleen is much more important because if the spleen ruptures, well, then you can bleed out really, really quickly. So that's always something that you're going to have to check for when you're in the emergency room.
The next organ that I want to talk about is the tonsils. So the tonsils are a set of organs that live near the back of the throat. They're often removed in people that have recurrent tonsillitis. That's inflammation of the tonsils. And maybe that's how you've heard of these before. You've probably heard somebody say, so-and-so had their tonsils removed. And, that happens in people where you just have, recurring bouts of inflammation of the tonsils. The tonsils, like all the other organs really that I've talked about, they're immune organs. Like the spleen, they contain a bunch of different white blood cells. And in that way, the tonsils are kind of the first line of defense against potential respiratory pathogens, right? As you breathe them in, they might see the tonsils, and therefore some of those immune cells are exposed to those pathogens as you breathe them in, and you can start fighting whatever it is that is gotten in the body. Now, with that said, one thing I mentioned earlier was this lymphoid tissue. One of the lymphoid tissues, and this is kind of like the umbrella term for lymphoid tissues, is mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT. This, again, is a specific type of lymphoid tissue. And what it is kind of a spread out system of lymphoid tissue that's found in various sites in the body. This includes gut-associated lymphoid tissue, GALT, and Peyer's patches. So I want to get a little bit more into the Peyer's patches because they're kind of interesting. So gut-associated lymphoid tissue, GALT, that I just mentioned, consists of isolated or aggregated lymphoid tissue forming what are called Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches are essentially the immune sensors of the intestine. They kind of do what the tonsils do, but in the gut. They look for pathogens that are coming through the gut and are able to respond to them very quickly if they come across one. Basically, antigens that are present in the lumen of the intestine, that's inside the intestine, are picked up by cells on the surface of the Peyer's patches and taken to immune cells that are housed within these patches. As one paper puts it, M cells, which are immune cells that are on the surface of Peyer's patches, are able to transport luminal antigens and bacteria toward the underlying immune cells that activate or inhibit the immune response, leading to either tolerance or systemic immune cell response. All right, so now that the boring part is over, the anatomy, let's talk about the more interesting stuff, physiology.
At Med School Coach, we know that studying for the MCAT exam can be challenging, especially for busy students on the go. That's why our team created MCAT Prep, the only all-encompassing study app built specifically for the MCAT. MCAT Prep by Med School Coach provides student access to extremely high-quality content and a personalized curriculum for free. The app has more than 250 videos, 1,000 flashcards, and 1,000 unique MCAT questions. Plus, MCAT Prep by Med School Coach allows students to create a personalized study schedule and track progress over time. You need every competitive advantage you can get to get into medical school, and now you can put the experts from Med School Coach into your pocket. It's the closest pre-med students can come to a personal tutor without spending a penny. Download MCAT Prep by Med School Coach for free at medschoolcoach.com/MCAT. Or download it directly from the Apple Store or Google Play Store. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and MCAT Prep by Med School Coach can help.
As I mentioned earlier, there are several functions that the lymphatic system serves. Primarily, it serves to, number one, return fluid and other materials to the blood. In that same vein, it helps equalize fluid distribution in the body. Number two, it supports the immune system. And number three, it helps in the absorption of fats and fat-soluble nutrients. So what I want to do here is I want to take a deeper dive into those three functions, starting with the first one. All right, I want to start out by saying something that is true, but that I don't really think about very often. And that's that our vessels, especially our capillaries, are leaky. They literally leak fluid just constantly. And that kind of sounds like a bad thing, but really it's a good thing. And that's because it allows nutrients to move from the blood into cells in the periphery, like into, say, our myocytes, muscle cells, for example. In this context, something that I've never really considered is what happens to all the fluid that leaks out of the capillaries. Sure, some of the nutrients in this fluid make their way into the cell, but a lot of that fluid won't. It just kind of hangs out in the interstitium. And when I say interstitium, by the way, I'm talking about the fluid-filled space that lies in between cells and vessels. And just as a quick aside here, the fluid that is leaking out of capillaries isn't just pure water. That might be how you're imagining it, but that's not quite how it is. So it also contains a lot of these same components as blood plasma. It'll have proteins, pathogens, triglycerides, ions, etc. That's just something that's important to keep in mind as we go forward. The fluid that is leaking out isn't just pure water. Again, it's got a bunch of different good things in it. With that said, if more of this fluid were to keep building up in the interstitium, that would be bad news. It can actually lead to a condition known as edema. Alex, have you ever seen anybody with edema before?
Yeah, plenty actually. And what it looks like if you were to, it's usually in the legs, right? And so if you were to squeeze down on their legs and remove your fingers, the indentations that your fingers have made will stay there for a while. It's a very, very interesting thing.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not a good thing. And so what your body needs to do is get rid of that fluid that is in the interstitium, or at least make sure that it's not building up there. And so most of this fluid is actually reabsorbed by the capillaries. About 80% of it is reabsorbed there. Interestingly, though, the rest of it is absorbed by the lymphatic capillaries. These are a series of really small lymphatic vessels that run alongside the capillaries. Once fluid from the interstitium is absorbed by the lymphatic capillaries, it becomes what we call lymph. Again, that's the milky-looking fluid that is inside of the lymphatic system. Now, where does this fluid go once it gets inside of the lymphatic system? Well, let's say, for example, we're talking about a cluster of lymphatic capillaries that's in the groin area. The lymph here is going to make its way into bigger and bigger lymphatic vessels as it makes its way up towards the cisterna kylie and towards the thoracic duct. So it's going from the groin upwards towards the belly button, then, up kind of in the chest area, and then it's going to spit out through the thoracic duct into the subclavian and jugular veins. And I mentioned this earlier, and I'll remind you again, the thoracic duct dumps fluid back into the blood. And so through this action, basically taking interstitial fluid and the other molecules that are in it and transporting it back to the bloodstream, the lymphatic system returns materials to the blood and equalizes fluid distribution. So that's function numero uno. Let's talk next about how the lymphatic system supports the immune system. And I've kind of touched quite a bit on this as I've talked about the different structures, but I'll give you a broader look here. So in my mind, there's really two different ways that the lymphatic system helps mount immune responses. Number one, it helps the cells in our immune system grow and mature. I've talked quite a bit about this, right? T cells grow and mature within the thymus, B cells mature and grow within the bone marrow. But another way that I've yet to talk about, and this is the second way, is that lymph is monitored for any pathogens and an immune response is mounted if one is encountered. Here's where that thing I told you to keep in mind comes in. So many different molecules get filtered into the interstitial fluid. This includes pathogens, that being viruses, bacteria, cancerous cells, etc. And by the way, these pathogens don't necessarily have to come from the bloodstream to get into the interstitial fluid. They can come from cells or tissue or whatever is adjacent to interstitial fluid. The important thing here to remember is that pathogens can make their way into the interstitial fluid. And of course, some of that interstitial fluid, as I just mentioned, is going to be absorbed by the lymphatic system. It's going to become part of the lymph. And that lymph flows throughout the lymphatic system. And so let's say, for instance, that a pathogen, a bacteria, is absorbed into the lymphatic system. It's going to flow with the lymph as it makes its way through the lymphatic system. And before being dumped out back into the blood, it's going to make a few stops. I mean, you can kind of think about these as like checkpoints. So what happens to the lymph as it circulates is it goes through lymph nodes, it goes through the spleen, it goes through various types of mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. These house a shit ton of different immune cells that, in a sense, screen all the molecules in the lymph as they pass by. Sort of like what TSA does to luggage when you're traveling. And there's one video I watched where the guy equated this function of the immune system to TSA, and that's an analogy I really like. I don't know about you, Alex. I think it's a fantastic analogy.
Yeah, that is a great picture.
Now, what happens if the immune cells find a pathogen is that they can start to mount an immune response. Basically, immune cells within the lymph nodes, spleen, and other places are activated and alert the other cells about this pathogen that they found. And then these cells can start hunting down the pathogen and can start producing antibodies. So that is function 2. That's how the lymphatic system contributes to immunity. In a sense, the lymphatic system acts like TSA and screens the lymphatic fluid, which comes from, again, blood, tissues, and other cells. And it screens that lymph for pathogens and acts to eliminate them. Finally, we've made it to the very last function of the lymphatic system. And this is kind of the most well-known one to me that I mentioned earlier. That's the absorption of fats and fat-soluble nutrients. So to really understand this, we got to take a step back first. Think back to the digestive system and think about how the digestion of fats occurs. So first off, since fats are pretty hydrophobic, they're not going to dissolve in the lumen the way that carbohydrates, for example, would. They need a little bit of help dissolving, and this is where bile comes in. Bile is secreted into the lumen of the small intestine, and it's actually going to act to emulsify fats, which basically means it's going to break them down into these very small packages of fats called micelles. These micelles are able to be absorbed by enterocytes. Enterocytes are endothelial cells that are in the small intestine. Now, once inside the enterocytes, the micelles, which are mostly made of fatty acids, are assembled into triglycerides. These are then packaged with phospholipids, cholesterol, and protein to make what are called chylomicrons, which are these very large lipoproteins. And here now is where the lymphatic system comes into play. Most of the chylomicrons that are assembled exit the enterocyte via exocytosis and enter what's called a lacteal. A lacteal is essentially a lymphatic vessel. So at this point, fat has entered the lymphatic system. I'll mention here too that some of the fat-soluble nutrients, like for example vitamin A, D, E, and K, are absorbed in this way too. So fats absorbed not into the bloodstream directly, rather they go into the lymphatic system and then into the blood as, the lymphatic system dumps lymph back into the blood out of the ducts. Now, one thing that this got me thinking about is why does this occur? Why does the fat not just go straight into the bloodstream like a lot of the other nutrients, like carbs and proteins, for example? Well, this is for your interest only. I doubt this would be tested on the MCAT, but apparently, in doing this process where fats enter the lymphatic system, this allows lipids to be available for storage and energy throughout the body before these fats arrive to the liver. See, once these fats make their way to the liver, they're modified and broken down. A lot of fat metabolism occurs in hepatocytes, which are cells in the liver. So basically, since the lymphatic system bypasses the liver, it gives other parts of the body a chance to use the digested fats before the liver eats them all up. All right, so that is the third and final function of the lymphatic system, absorbing fats and fat-soluble nutrients. Alex, with that said, is there anything else about the lymphatic system that you want our listeners to know about? Anything interesting that you know?
Yes, and I'll preface this by saying this will not be on your MCAT, but it is really cool. So, something incredibly fascinating that is currently a major area of research is the connection between the lymphatic system and the brain. So, for a long time, the scientists have known that the brain is what we would call immune privileged, meaning that there's not really an inflammatory response when the brain encounters an antigen. So, this definitely would make evolutionary sense because it protects the brain from most autoimmune disorders. What is equated to in, I guess, biological history, if you will, is that there's been no proof that or idea that the lymphatic system plays any role whatsoever with the brain. That's how I learned it when I went to school. So, a few years, this all changed. So, researchers were doing some experiments and they tagged lymphatic vessels in mice with radio labels. And then, with fluorescent microscopy, they're able to identify these really stealthily hidden lymph vessels that were hiding in the brain's meninges.
Hmm.
Yeah, very interesting. That changed a lot of things. A lot of research has been going into this. So, another really interesting thing was that scientists took mice, they knocked out their T cell production, and they witnessed a significant decline in the cognitive functioning compared to control mice. But when they took those same knockout mice and they added the T cell function back in, the cognitive abilities returned to normal. They're perfect. There was no issue. So mice brains are not human brains, but there are pretty good models, and so apparently T cells and cognitive functioning have some sort of link.
Do you know the proposed link?
Yeah, that is a great question. So that's one of the um, major functions that right now, and of course, this cutting edge area of biology. So what I understand now may change in a couple years, but one of the major functions here is that there's communication from the microglia, which essentially microglia do a lot of things, but one of which is they perform analogous immune functions in the brain that like the peripheral immune system would do, and they communicate to the lymph system, and of course it's a back and forth to some degree about what's going on in the brain and what's going on in the body. So if T cells aren't able to, I guess, come up to the brain, they of course can't cross into the brain, but if they're able to come to the brain and communicate with their buddies on the other side of the wall, somehow that has something to do with the cognitive functioning. That's the working theory right now.
Very interesting.
Yeah, but maybe more importantly, and this actually might play in with that mechanism that you asked about, is that the lymph vessels that are in the meninges have been shown to drain proteins in large waste molecules from the brain. Now, Sam, I bet I know what you're thinking.
What's that?
Does this play a role in dementia? And the answer is maybe. They do think it does, and if you think about it, clearing the proteins in the waste that get in the way of synapses, which are a big, kind of the culprit for these dementia and Alzheimer's. Well, I mean, if you clear those out, then you probably wouldn't have these neurodegenerative diseases. So, the last thing I'll mention about this phenomenon is that, at least in mice, the draining of waste products from the brain into the lymphatic system appears to only occur when they sleep. And that's because, for whatever reason, the epinephrine signaling during the day interferes with this. So the moral of the story is, if you don't want your brain to clog up, make sure you're sleeping.
So it sounds like, just to summarize that and kind of ask you a question, is part of the function of these lymphatic vessels that were hidden for a long time, or I guess that we didn't know about for a long time, that go up into the brain, that's to kind of take some of, buildup of proteins, whatever, et cetera, and take them out of the brain. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. So all of our cells, as you know, like we produce with metabolism, there's a lot of metabolic wastes that are there, proteins that we don't need anymore, and that are not in cells, and so they can't really make it into the proteasome in the cell to get recycled. Those have to go somewhere, and the lymph system and the most of the body helps with that, of course. But now it looks like it's also helping the brain out by taking all of their garbage and transporting it back into the body.
Gotcha. Very interesting. Well, Alex, thank you so much for being willing to take over this podcast. Again, I think the listeners, you guys are in great hands, and I'm sure Alex will be bringing you guys some really good content coming up here soon.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be taking over, and of course, best of luck in medical school. I'll be sure to ask you to come back and do some guest spots, and you can update us with how you're adjusting to the fire hose of information that you're about to have.
Yeah, for sure.
And of course, if there's anything that anybody has been wanting to hear, feel free to send us an email, and I'll make sure to cover it.
So that's it for the Lymphatic System podcast. As always, if you like what we do, please go leave us a review on iTunes. Helps us in the rankings. And also, feel free to reach out about topics you want to see on future episodes. Feel free to shoot me questions about med school, about the application process. I'm always totally happy to answer those questions. And for those of you who have been listening for a while, thanks a bunch for tuning in. It's been super fun to run this podcast over the last few years. I've really enjoyed it. I'll miss it, but who knows, maybe I'll do another podcast in medical school. We'll see.
Each episode of MCAT Basics is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access Med School Coach services, including MCAT tutoring and medical school admissions advising, visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Good luck as you prepare for the MCAT, and we hope you tune in again next time.